Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known on this Thursday, January 20th, 2022. Today, we are talking about being Black and being strapped. Amid a recent nationwide surge in gun sales, these folks, women and men, are part of the growing coalition of gun ownership that is increasingly made of people of color. A new survey says 59% of new gun ownership belongs to African Americans. But in Texas, a law that's on the books now that requires or doesn't require permits to carry firearms can cause even more problems for African Americans in this world in which we live in. We have a lot of interaction or unfortunate interaction with police. To talk about it this morning is Sam Collins of the Washington Informer, ReShonda Tate Billingsley of the Defender out in Texas, and of course, Representative Ron Reynolds of Texas, and the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Dr. Benjamin Chavis Jr. Well, first, let's bring on Dr. Chavis and Sam Collins as we discuss the headlines of the day. Good morning, Dr. Chavis.
Good morning, Stacey, and good morning, Sam.
Morning.
On behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Karen Carter Richards, the chair of the NNPA, down representing the Forward Times in Houston, Texas, and also representing all of our 230 African-American owned newspapers and media companies throughout the United States. This is another Thursday. This is another day. After what the Senate did last night, we got plenty of news, and certainly this issue of guns in the Black community is something that we need to address. So I'm glad to be a part of the program.
Absolutely. And we start, Dr. Chavis and Sam Collins. 3 police officers were criminally charged in the fatal shooting of an 8-year-old girl outside a high school football game near Philadelphia 5 months ago. The men, Devin Smith, who is 34 years old, along with his partners, were on patrol as crowds were leaving a football game, and that's when gunshots erupted in the 900 block of Coach Street, and the officers discharged their service weapons in the direction of the Academy Park football field. Fanta Bility, at 8 years old, was killed in the volley, and now prosecutors say that they've concluded that a crime has been committed. Dr. Chavis, Sam, we know that these incidents happen far too often now. The life of a young one has been claimed by apparent misconduct by police. Sam?
You're right. It does happen way too often. And one thing I can say now is I think it's an incremental improvement in seeing that officers are brought to justice. And I think that it's a testament to the work that has been done on the ground over the last few years and bringing attention to incidences of police brutality. Police brutality there's a wide spectrum of what can constitute as that. And I think this is one example. They didn't directly target this young woman, but their reckless use of weapons did affect this woman's life. I mean, this young lady's life, took her life away. And I think as we continue, or people continue to organize around bringing light to these issues, we need to be very honest about what police are here for. By definition, police are here to protect businesses and protect money, not necessarily to protect people. And once we get out of our mind that police are here to protect and serve everyday people, then we can accept the reality of our relationship with the police force and aggressively advocate and organize around more alternatives to police presence. Police should not be on the ground reporting reactively to many things. We should have more wraparound services that address the ills in our society.
And Dr. Chavis, what is your thoughts as well?
Well, thank you. I agree with Sam. First of all, racially motivated police brutality is still continuing across the United States. It's a national problem. And yes, More and more police officers have been indicted. A few are actually going to jail. But the magnitude of whether or not there's justice and equality and fairness toward African Americans is still, we all know that that's not the case yet. So we got to continue to press forward. I'm still hoping that the Senate will eventually pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, as well as the other legislations that are vital to the quality of life of Black America.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the news this morning, Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, said that her office has uncovered significant evidence of fraud in her civil investigation of former President Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. The unusual statement amid an ongoing investigation came as James' office argued in court papers that Donald Trump Jr., and Ivanka Trump have not sufficiently responded to subpoenas. Thus, Letitia James says, thus far in our investigation, we have uncovered significant evidence that suggests that they have falsely and fraudulently valued multiple assets and misrepresented those values to financial institutions for economic benefits. Letitia James recently announced that she was running for re-election. She was not running for a governor of New York so she can concentrate specifically on the Trump case. She's not giving up, guys.
Well, she's a strong, I know Attorney Letitia James. She was a great defense counsel in Brooklyn years ago before she became the New York State Attorney General. And I think that if there's anybody that's going to bring the people in the Trump organizations to justice, it will be Attorney General Letitia James.
Yeah, and Sam, it seems like they're the only avenue, despite the January 6th commission, because there's no charges related to that have been filed against Trump or any of his family members. But it seems like the civil way is the method that's being used both in Georgia and certainly in New York with Letitia James to try and bring some sort of justice about and around Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's the only arena where Donald Trump doesn't really have influence over people who see him with rose-colored glasses or see him in a political manner. And you know, I'm looking forward to seeing more instances across whichever part of the United States where people can take chunks at the Trump organization in piecemeal ways. Frankly, this has been a long time coming, and Donald Trump is the most egregious example of misuse of power. He's not the only one, of course, but he did make it to the presidency in part by implementing a lot of what he has done in his organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the news yesterday, we didn't bring you this story. Wanted to make sure that we covered this as well. Fashion icon and former Vogue editor Andre Leon Talley has died at the age of 73. A statement released on his official Instagram confirmed his death. The statement said, "It is with great sadness we announce the passing of Andre Leon Talley on January 18th, 2022 in New York." Mr. Talley was the larger-than-life, longtime creative director at Vogue during its rise to dominance as the world's fashion Bible. The cause of his death was not disclosed. The statement continues, it says, "Over the past 5 decades, as an international icon, was a close confidant of Yves Saint Laurent, Karl Lagerfeld, Paloma Picasso, and he had a penchant for discovering, nurturing, and celebrating young designers." His byline appeared in Vanity Fair, HG, Interview, Ebony, and Women's Wear Daily, and he was the editor of Numero Russia. Yeah, he left his imprint, Sam, Dr. Chavis.
Yes, I knew him. He's my homeboy. He's from North Carolina, from Durham, North Carolina. Went to Hillside High School in Durham. Great fashion icon. You know, Brother Talley is going to leave his imprint and legacy over the entire world, not just in the United States. But it shows what happens when people of African descent strive for excellence and attain excellence and spreads that excellence globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And thoughts from you, Sam?
I didn't know him, man. The funny thing is, being in the age of Instagram, when people pass away, you get to see their larger than life presence, because a lot of people in my network posted photos with the late Bob Talley, and it was just really cool seeing his impact on their careers. People who were in the fashion industry, media industry, and even those who just followed his work. And during times like this, I think it's I'm grateful to the Black press that we get to chronicle his work, and I think that we should continue to do so and make that connection to what's happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are black, and we are strapped nowadays. More and more African Americans are owning guns and carrying guns. Well, we're going to bring on some experts to talk about that, including Sam Collins. But ReShonda Tate Billingsley has written extensively about this. We bring her on, as well as Texas Rep. Ron Reynolds, where a new law now allows for permitless carry. So let's say good morning to ReShonda and, of course, Representative Ron Reynolds and the Let It Be Known's Chief Legal Analyst, Robert Tarver, at the Tarver Law Firm in New Jersey. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, let's start with ReShonda. You've written about this issue, the issue of the Texas law that allows for permit carry, but more Black people are carrying guns. So let's start with you, ReShonda. In your reporting, what have you found?
Well, we definitely found that more African Americans are strapping themselves. The permitless carry, we think, a lot of people that we've interviewed think that it will backfire, and Texans, Black Texans will bear the brunt of that, because this is going to boil down to people using their own discernment to declare who's the bad guy with the gun versus who's the good guy with the gun. And so Black people know when you're using that analogy, they'll often be determined to be the bad guy. And so they're strapping themselves.
Yeah, and legally, Attorney Tarver, ReShonda just mentioned some things. Talk about the legal aspect of this, because we know, we talk about Black and being strapped. Well, when it comes to the law, we usually get the bottom of the stick, or the other side comes against us.
Yeah, generally the problem has been historically, and I've seen this over and over again, that when you look at police officers and others, how they view African Americans generally as being a dangerous force. Well, when you have that dangerous force being allowed to carry a gun in public, we bear a higher burden and a higher risk of being in a position of being injured as a result of gun ownership. I have to tell you, I'm a Marine. I've had guns all my life, been around guns all my life, and I always support Black gun ownership. But there is a risk, and we have to be very conscious of that particular risk. There's also a long legal history that follows Black gun ownership, and the fact that we had a much higher numbers of Black gun ownerships in the 1960s and the 1970s. That dropped at a certain point, in my mind, because of a concerted effort on the part of the majority to make sure that Black people were not eligible for gun ownership, by saying that if you had a criminal record of any sort, it would disqualify you from ownership of guns. So we have to look at this in the overall picture of where Black people have stood with regard to gun ownership.
Yeah, and Representative Reynolds, talk about that law, though, there in Texas, permitless carry.
Yeah, Stacy, good morning. I was very disappointed and disgusted that we passed this law. First of all, let me give you a backdrop. We had a rising number of mass shootings in the state, at churches, at schools, shopping centers, and there was a vow by Governor Abbott and many of my colleagues, even on the Republican side, that we were going to address the rising epidemic of mass shootings and gun violence, that we were going to look at that and possibly come up with some kind of common sense gun reforms. And what was our response? We came up with permitless carry. We actually made it more easy for people to get guns. We did nothing, absolutely nothing, to address gun violence. I gotta say this, even though it may be a little bit off topic, but it puts it in context. We made it harder to vote. We made it more difficult to vote. Texas was already one of the states that that was more difficult to vote. We made it even more difficult to vote with ridiculous voter suppression bills. Senate Bill 1. We made it easier to get a gun. So that was the mindset of our legislature this last session, where we were, instead of doing the right thing and addressing this gun epidemic, not taking away people's Second Amendment right to bear arms, we wanted to close the gun show loophole, maybe putting background checks, making sure that people were mentally ill, that they didn't get access to guns. It's easier to go fishing. It's easier to go fishing, or it's easier to get a gun than go fishing, because you need a license to go fishing, but you don't need a license. So what does that mean? We don't have any training. So people that have guns now, they have no training. You just have to be 21 years of age and older and go get a gun. If you don't have a felony, then you can go get a gun. You don't need any training on how to use the gun, no time at the gun range, no safe storage, nothing. And so this is going to lead to more deaths, more shootings, more unintended accidents with guns, more guns stolen. Police officers were adamantly against this bill. They thought that this was going to lead to more exchanges of gun violence. Instead of fights, people are going to now just go out like the Old West and have a shootout. You're not going to see gun fights anymore with fists. You're going to see fights with guns. So it's a terrible bill. There was no justification for it. And it just further shows you that the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is only concerned about gun sales because this makes it easier to get a gun so that people can buy more guns. But they're certainly not in the public health and safety of Texans nor any other state that has passed this law.
Yeah, and Sam, let me ask you this, Sam. What do you see as the primary reason that African Americans are gaining in gun ownership? More and more African Americans are getting guns.
Very good question, Stacey. The primary reason you see an increase in gun ownership among African Americans is, as I say time and time again, African Americans are behind enemy lines in the United States. We have no rapport or no institutional pull with the police department. They are shooting us. And you also have to watch out for people in our communities who we have to defend ourselves against, unfortunately. So in straying away from the liberal talking points about gun control and gun safety, African Americans are approaching the gun issue with a little bit more nuance, looking at it as an issue of self-defense, because by the end of the day, being behind enemy lines and without much institutional support, African Americans, especially those who live in their communities, who work regular jobs, who want the best for themselves and their families, they see themselves as the first line of defense. Because let's be honest, police most oftentimes do not arrive to the scene of the crime until well after the crime is committed. And even then, in collecting the information, they criminalize Black people. So in order for a Black person to defend themselves, their logic is that they have to be the first line of defense. And this has definitely increased in the time of when police brutality has made its way on social media, and you see more Black people really maturing in their understanding of gun ownership and what it means.
Yeah, I want to bring Dr. Chavis back into the conversation, because the question I have for you, Dr. Chavis, are you concerned, particularly when you have a state like Texas that has a law that permitless carry?
Well, I agree with Representative Reynolds that the Texas laws are repressive and regressive. I think on the one hand, they try to keep people from voting. On the other hand, they're trying to just spread guns out all over the place. I think that this lawlessness is going to hurt Black America. I think that we can't shoot our way to freedom. We have to organize and mobilize nonviolently. And I'm also concerned about some of the self-destruction that's going on in too many of our communities. In too many of our urban communities, we're killing each other, because of the prevalence of guns all over the place. So I'm not in favor of more guns into the hands of Americans, period. I think America has a gun problem. America has a race problem. And until we deal with the race problem and the gun problem, we're going to continue to have these disparities, and Black people are going to wind up getting always the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and ReShonda, with your reporting, along with what Dr. Chavis just said, and Sam's kind of touched on it as well, there's so much interaction, unfortunate and illegal interaction between the police and African Americans with the continued uptick in police shootings. How might this be more of a problem for Black America?
You know, I'll use an example in Dallas that happened during a protest a couple of years ago. They had a Black man with a gun who was legally carrying his weapon, and he was immediately deemed a suspect. This was when they had a rash of police shootings up there. And, you know, when they arrived on the scene, this guy who was legally carrying his gun was immediately a suspect. His picture was plastered everywhere, and the Dallas Police Department had to come back and retract that. I think we're going to see that quite often. I think that people are going to look and see a Black man with a gun and immediately deem them to be a threat. You know, another concern we found that from a lot of gun-toting Texans is they're going to use the "I feel threatened" defense when they pull their weapons, particularly on young Black men. You can imagine when, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a random person, when they see a Black man with a gun, legal or not, as Philando Castile, they're going to deem him as a threat. And that's going to have bad consequences for particularly African Americans.
You bring up such an important point, ReShonda, and I want to ask Representative Reynolds and Sam Collins. I was going to call you Sean for some reason, Sam. But this is interesting because we are seen or perceived as threats automatically, right? And now we're in a pandemic. We're carrying guns and we're wearing masks. Representative Reynolds, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Stacey, that when ReShonda hit on that point, I was recalling that incident in Dallas because that highlighted the problem that this bill is going to have. We're already deemed a threat. We're already deemed a threat by the nature of our skin. We're oftentimes, you see that there is just unconscious bias about a big Black man. You perceive him as a threat. Well, couple that with that Black man with a gun, legal or not, you're already putting yourself in a perilous situation where now they're going to use the excuse that ReShonda just mentioned. I fear for my life. I fear for my life. Or he was reaching for his gun, even though the gun may have been concealed. Now in Texas, we have open carry, so they can see your gun. You can choose to have your gun out in a holster, and so you are now making yourself a bigger target. Let's just be real. A white man with a gun and a Black man with a gun are going to be perceived totally different, and that is the unconscious bias that exists with people. And so there's going to need to be more training from our officers on interactions with the Black community and people. But I think it's going to lead to an escalation of shoot first and ask questions later. I perceive him as a threat, and lo and behold, if he had a gun, they're going to justify it as justifiable self-defense. So this law is going to have unintended consequences, I believe, and I hope I'm wrong about this. I pray that I'm wrong, of more and more Black men being killed. You already seen the escalation of unarmed Black men being killed. Now you're going to see more armed Black men being killed by law enforcement officers. Yeah,
and Sam, hold your thought for 1 second. I want to go to Attorney Tarver because you're a defense attorney, right?
Yes,
and so you might see more and more cases where you have to defend perhaps a Black man shooting someone standing his ground, right?
Sure. And it's happened in many different states. In Florida, you've had a number of those types of cases where African Americans have had that same problem. In fact, you've had police officers, Black police officers, who have been out of uniform and carrying, who have actually been confronted, who have been arrested, and who have been shot. But Stacey, there's a larger picture here. When you look at this is really Second Amendment expansion. And the fact of the matter is, in order to be able to do the things that the representative said, unintended consequences, I think that it may have some intended consequences, because Texas, just like Florida, has an expansion of right-wing activity. And quite frankly, one of the largest areas of expansion of gun ownership, aside from Black Americans, is militia. And to be able to effectuate the Second Amendment militia portion, the NRA has had a concerted effort toward allowing more people, whether Black or white, to be able to carry guns so that they can fulfill their Second Amendment militia dictate and mandate. And this is the problem, because it allows more people to be armed with more weapons, and the weapons that they're armed with are larger, higher caliber, and can do more damage.
Well, Sam, I want to bring up a couple of points that's being mentioned in our audience. First, our chair, Karen Carter Richards, I'm seeing her statement. She says it's a setup waiting to happen for Black people. Bobby Henry, the publisher of the West Side Gazette, says that old saying that if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have them. Let's be real. The atmosphere of America is pushing us to the ledge of a civil war. The question where they need to be asked, how will you engage in the Civil War? And David Youngblood mentions, Sam, that the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers have put us on notice. We were without guns during Reconstruction. That did not work out well for us. Sam, your response.
My qualm with us as Black people is that with the more accolades and letters we get behind our names, we become more beholden and more limited to laws that mean nothing to us. All throughout this discussion, and rightfully so, there have been fears expressed about what the law could mean for the safety of Black people, so forth and so on. I'm of the belief that Black people have been a threat to the status quo long before the law has passed. And there is no law, good, bad, or ugly, that will change that. And if somebody feels the need to defend themselves, they should not be worried about what a person thinks or if a person's going to fear them, because laws notwithstanding, there's the law of nature. And there is a carnal law, a law deep within the conscience of every animal, that self-defense is at the very core of who they are. And as human beings, we often get caught up in flowery language. We get caught up in institutions. We get caught up in things that are created out of our higher consciousness, where if we were just animals with base emotions, then self-defense wouldn't even be a question. Self-defense is the human way. And if you're taking away my right to self-defense, then that is a human crime. That is a crime against humanity. And oftentimes, as Black people, out of fear, we take away our right to self-defense by jumping ahead and asking, well, what if, they fear me more? Well, they already think that I'm a big Black person. Regardless of whether you're strapped or not, they still think that about you. And God forbid you're in a situation, especially in a rural area, where you're being surrounded by white militiamen and women sometimes, and you cannot defend yourself. And the police, who don't even like you, come well after the fact, and they don't investigate your murder or just whatever the case is. So the fact is, before I wrap up, is that as Black people, we have to ask ourselves, we have to be very honest about our relationship with the American government. And once again, we got to come to terms with the fact that once again, we are behind enemy lines. And for the time being, these laws do not matter to us. Okay, the Constitution was written in the late 1700s. And during the writing of the Constitution and the laws that came after that, we were considered 3/5 of a person. So by virtue, we are behind enemy lines, and we are not even considered part of the Constitution. Anytime they have to write you in amendments rather than scrap the whole Constitution and write it over again, this country is not for you. So no matter what happens, we have to protect ourselves. And if that means going back to our base animal instinct, then so be it.
Well, Paris Brown of the Baltimore Times writes in that the NRA owes some accountability for the increase in gun violence. I know that's a hotbed issue right there, a hot button issue, I should say, Representative Reynolds, especially in the political world.
Well, here's the reality, Stacey, that I hate to say it, but I'm going to speak truth to power. The NRA has really had a profound impact among lawmakers basically writing these laws because they're the goose that lays the golden egg. They expend huge campaign contributions because of these record gun sales. There's more largesse to go around, and their lobbyists are very active when it comes to campaigns, and they campaign heavily for many of the Republicans and a few of the Democrats that tend to be pro-gun ownership. And so what they effectively do is have a very strict litmus test. They have a report card that shows how you vote on this issue, on this proposal, on this amendment, and any vote for any kind of gun control reform. That means that if you want to expand background checks, you want to close the gun show loophole. So basically, in this state, you have to get a background check for a regular gun sale. But if you go to a gun show at your convention center that comes to town, there is no background check. So you don't have to pass a background check to purchase a gun when you go to a gun show. That's a gun show loophole. In a private sale, if you want to go buy a gun from me at my house, there is no background check, but that could do a legal gun sale, transfer of gun ownership. So we have gun background check loopholes in this state and in this country that can be closed, but the NRA opposes all of that. They oppose anything that makes it more difficult to purchase a gun. And unfortunately, lawmakers are at their beck and call because they want those campaign contributions. And for me, I'm sick and tired of seeing excuses about why we can't make even common sense gun reform. Only thing we do after mass shooting is hope and prayers. I'm a man of faith, but my faith teaches me that faith without works is dead. We need action. We need more than prayers. Every time we have a mass shooting, we say we're going to do something, and we never do it because of the NRA. They come in and they stop any type of progress. And I don't know how many more kids need to die, how many more seniors need to die, how many more people need to die in places of worship before we finally do something about this pandemic. Like, President Chavez said, we have a gun problem in this country. That is for sure.
Well, ReShonda, you've done a lot of reporting on this issue, as we stated earlier. I want to lift up a couple more comments and see if you found this in your reporting, the responses to your reporting. Claudette Perry, the executive administrator for the NMPA, she mentions two things. She says survival is the first law of nature. And then she also says that not carrying does not resolve these issues. Things have to happen before this issue can be civically and socially dealt with. Someone will have to be the casualty before this issue will be socially discussed and somewhat resolved. Has that been the theme that you found throughout your reporting on this, ReShonda?
Yes, we actually had readers weigh in on the new Texas law, and there has been a dynamic shift in the mindset of gun ownership with African Americans. There were several readers that felt like it's going to be open season, and so they're strapping themselves. They said it's needful for us to carry and defend ourselves against both, the possibility of foul play. There are people that said their families are getting trained. Many people actually started getting trained when Donald Trump was in office, and now they have developed a stay ready so you don't have to get ready mentality. Now, people are complaining that you have to have a driver's license to get a car here in Texas, so you should at least need to have a permit where you get some type of training, but they're being ready. They're arming themselves. I've even found myself personally having a shift in mindset of gun ownership. Never was for it, but now I see the need to protect my family. Been trained in it, and that was the kind of universal theme we found among the people we were talking to.
Wow, just some statistics. About 40% of gun buyers in 2020, now this is the beginning of the pandemic, right? About 40% purchased a firearm for the first time, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is an industry trade group that compares the FBI's background check data with sales data. Customers are increasingly diverse, they found. Surveys last year showed a 58% increase, as we said at the top, of African-American gun buyers in 2020 compared to 2019. So it is truly a fact that more and more African-Americans are buying guns or carrying guns. Attorney Tarver, when you hear those statistics and understand this conversation that we've already had, give us some legal advice for those who might particularly, of course, African Americans who might want to carry firearms, and particularly in Texas?
Well, the one thing that I've said, and I've had to say this to my clients who have been involved in open carry in this state and other states, is that you have to be very deliberate about your carry. There are devices that you can use that make it very clear that you are carrying a weapon. And if you're going to open carry, it sometimes behooves you to carry in an open and notorious fashion with an open and outward holster. I've said also that where there are situations where you find yourself to be approached by police, you have to make it very clear. We have a higher burden as Black people to make it very clear that we are not a threat. And that's one of the things that the representative made very clear, that we bear a higher burden of this whole notion of gun ownership. So we have to behave in a way to keep ourselves safe that other people don't, which is to make sure that people know that we are carrying, and we are carrying in a lawful fashion, and that our intentions, unfortunately, are good and not nefarious. And that's what's important toward keeping people safe. That's one of the overriding things that we have to make sure that we point out, is that if you are going to carry, if you are going to have it in this fashion, make sure that you're safe, because society says that we bear a higher burden and risk.
Yeah, and along those lines, Sam, I'm looking at another comment from Claudette Perry. She says 48 design standards for a teddy bear, but there are no design standards for a handgun. Sam?
That's very true. I mean, regardless, I think the fact remains that in these times we have to really stay true to what our goal is as people, and self-defense has to be at the top of that. In terms of gun ownership and gun safety, I like the idea of people training as families, and I think that speaks to how seriously we take gun safety. We're not out here getting guns to just kill people haphazardly and whatnot. It's really for a reason, utility. And whether or not the laws pass, it's incumbent upon Black people to really change their relationship with guns. And one thing I will say about the whole gun safety issue in urban communities, violence in urban communities is a symptom of a larger problem. Whether you have guns or not, people will continue to harm one another if things below the surface are not tended to. So I would really like to see us separate those two issues.
Yeah, I would like to have a conversation with Miss Perry to find out how she know about 48 design standards for a teddy bear. That's awesome. But not to get off track, Dr. Chavis, so you're hearing this conversation. Obviously, you're here, and I'm looking at what David Youngblood is saying here, and what Bobby Henry is saying. They're both pretty much saying the same thing. David says, open season on us. We've been put on notice. Look around at state legislatures and see the laws designed specifically to harm Black people.
Well, first of all, I think this is a great discussion. And I just want to remind everybody that open season started in 1519. It just didn't start. And this idea about militias attacking Black people, yes, they're threatening us, and I believe in self-defense. But I also believe that we need to look at our own situation internally first. If you're going to strap with a gun, that's what physically, you better also strap something in your mind. Strap something. We have self-hatred. We're taught to hate each other. And that's why we have all this violence going on in our community. The greatest threat to Black life right now, in too many of our communities, is not white people. We're killing each other. That's why we had the Million Man March in 1995, because young Black males were considered an endangered species because we were killing each other. Now, thank God at the Million Man March, we halted that violence and we began to reverse it. But I think this is not a debate about self-defense. Absolutely, we have to defend ourselves. But how we defend ourselves, that's the question. you know, and just having a gun with no training, having bullets with not knowing how to shoot straight, that is not going to be the solution. And I think that these laws in Texas and Florida are not designed to protect Black people. And the question about open season, yes, there's open season. There's been open season. The question is, we have to open our minds. We have to open our love. We need more self-love in the Black community and less self-hatred. We need less self-destruction in the Black community, particularly among young brothers and sisters who think that disproportionately that smoking a brother or sister is something to be proud of. It is not. Every life is precious life. But if we don't raise our understanding how precious a Black life is, then you're not going to have an understanding about how precious all life is. So self-love is a part of self-defense.
And Representative Reynolds, so they're making these laws. Is there anything in the pipeline to try and kind of curtail this? I know we talked earlier about the NRA and how powerful they are, and particularly because, let's face it, like you said, speaking truth to power, they're in a lot of pockets of politicians. What are you seeing among at least the Democrats in Texas as far as trying to make sense of all this and put together sensible legislation?
Well, Stacey, I can tell you that most of my Democratic colleagues are very much opposed to the what they like to call it, fancy word, constitutional carry. It's permitless carry. It's senseless carry is what I call it. But there is no, unfortunately, until elections change, and I tell people all the time, elections matter. Elections have consequences. There will be no paradigm shift. There will be no reforms. There will be no movement to make some of these laws, take them off the books or amend them. Because right now I see a mentality, they want further and further, gun rights to make it more easier to get a gun. So we started off with open carry, and then we had campus carry, where you could carry on college campuses and schools. Now you see a shift toward permitless carry. I think the next thing is, hey, buy one, get one free law. I don't know. I mean, it's senseless. They keep coming up with new things to make gun access more accessible. So I don't see it getting any better anytime soon. I think that until the electorate demands it at the ballot box, and there's accountability between the far right, who are going far and farther and further to the right, until they are held accountable in their primaries, because of gerrymandering, most of the elections are won in March when we have our primaries, and very few are won in November, until they start making that a part of the litmus test that their electorate believes in gun reforms or sensible gun ownership. You're not going to see any changes in Texas.
Well, let me stop you right there, Representative Reynolds, because we talked earlier in the news topics. Well, Dr. Chavis brought up what happened last night with the voting rights laws being shot down. So when you say at the ballot box, they are preventing Black people from going to the ballot box.
Stacey, that's a fact. That's a truth. This is not about voter integrity or preventing voter fraud. This is voter suppression, Jim Crow 2.0. I want you to hear me clearly. They want to intentionally, there is no unintended consequence. They want to intentionally keep Black and brown people from voting, making it more difficult, because they're more likely to vote Democrat. And that way they can win by subtraction, win by less people voting, hold on to power, gain control back of the Senate and the House. And that is really what the whole end game is. This is not being a statesman. This is not about protecting the constitutional fundamental right to vote. This is about making voting more difficult, easier to invalidate elections. Where they had very restrictive voter ID laws, now they want to empower partisan poll watchers, make voting by mail more difficult. They're already throwing out thousands of ballots in Texas already. This law took effect in December, and now we're already seeing the impact of it. So make no bones about it. When that bill fell yesterday in the United States Senate, it was an assault on the many people who gave their life to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So Black and brown people could have access to the ballot box. We've gone backwards in this country, and shame on those Democrats, those two Democrats that didn't allow for the filibuster, because the filibuster is a relic of the Jim Crow South that is now preventing this type of legislation from being implemented. And I'm disgusted by what I saw on that Senate floor last night.
Well, you know, what's interesting too is Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell actually spoke out loud what many of them thought. He made a distinction that African Americans are different from Americans. Those were his words. And that is really amazing that he came out and pretty much broke it into two, right? We're back to the white fountain and the colored fountain, according to Mitch McConnell. But I digress, I guess. Attorney Tarver, here's another issue, though, is, okay, so they passed these laws. The Department of Justice can challenge certain laws that have gone through, right? But we know that the Department of Justice under Trump did nothing. Department of Justice under Biden has been pretty much rendered impotent, if I can say that word, y'all, under this administration, because the Supreme Court is conservative. So where do you go, Attorney Tarver?
Well, if you're talking about the Second Amendment, the fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court has been tending right for a long time. And under the Heller case and other cases, the trend is going toward allowing people, even under the Second Amendment, to have free and unfettered gun rights. Look, the issues are really simple. And all of this comes down to one four-letter word, which is fear. What you've talked about with voting rights is fear. What you've talked about with gun ownership is fear. I'm old enough to remember when the NRA stood for responsible gun ownership, until the images of Huey Newton and others in California carrying automatic weapons filled the minds of white Americans and became the poster for the need for white gun ownership. That's what the NRA built their support on, fear of a black planet. And we have to be very real about how we got to where we got to. Black gun ownership, good, no question about it. Responsible gun ownership for all people, that's what the issue really is. And that's where we need to hone in our thoughts. The Supreme Court, however, is moving further and further to the right, saying that the states should be able to make their own decisions about these things. And I've got to tell you, when it comes to history and a legal perspective, states' rights has always been something that we as people of color, we as Black people, have had a problem with, because it was states' rights that allowed for segregation to prosper, for Jim Crow to prosper. It was only the federal government who was able to rescue us with regard to being able to federalize our rights across this nation. And so you're going to see a lot more of this. You're going to see a lot more of Second Amendment pushes for the allowances of gun ownership across the states. And this Supreme Court, as you rightfully point out, Stacey, is not going to help us.
Yeah, Sam, I want to highlight, I really appreciate our viewers, because they really bring it when it comes to these type of conversations. And David Youngblood obviously takes a lead a lot in that. He says that they want compliant and happy Negroes. And he says, I think they're serious when they say they want a race war. Sam, I want your thoughts on that.
We're already in a race war of sorts, and the race war has had it's been ebbing and flowing, especially since the passage of civil rights legislation. If you go back to the 90s, in the time of Timothy McVeigh, a lot of the conservative white extremist groups, they took to the Midwest and portions of the West Coast, and they had their enclaves. They were speaking out against African Americans, people of the Jewish faith, so forth and so on. You saw this with the Tea Party during the Obama administration. You saw this with the rise of Trump. And, race always plays a part. It's in the fabric of the American system. And when I say that we're behind enemy lines, in reference to what I saw earlier in the comments, what I mean is that as Black people, we don't control institutions in this country. So we are always dependent on laws and institutions that do not favor us by design, which is why we have to be very creative about how it is that we respond in times like this. We have to come with that understanding that regardless of whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, a lot of your fate as a person in this country relies on race. And even behind that comes economics. But by the end of the day, economics is determined by race, because you have people who pretty much coalesce around issues related to maintaining their hold on what they have. We have to come to the playing field with that. And the sooner we realize that, the better we will become as a people. And if that means strapping up, if that means practicing responsible gun ownership, if that means educating our children about the reality of this country and where they come from, then so be it. But we have to do it sooner than later, because time is ticking. And this country has always been conservative. It has always been anti-Black, and for good reason. Our potential is way more than what we can imagine. I would even argue that they know our potential more than we do. And they hinder us by making us buy into these laws and buy into these standards of conduct that even they don't follow.
Yeah, and Attorney Tarver, I want to lift up this comment. Again, the NMPA's Executive Administrator Claudette Perry writes that the Supreme Court reinterpreted the Second Amendment under the Bush administration. I want to get your thoughts on that.
They did. They broadened the idea that the Second Amendment, you see, the Second Amendment ties gun ownership to a well-ordered militia. And at the time, the militia was the armed force within the country. They've misinterpreted that, or interpreted it in a certain way, to say that Americans have the right to be well armed, and to be well armed to the extent that that state regulation or federal regulation cannot impede in any meaningful way with that gun ownership. The problem is that the Second Amendment purists believe that there should be gun ownership with no obligations, and the obligations to be registered properly, the obligations to be trained properly, the obligation to make sure that other persons are not harmed by your gun ownership. Part of the problem is that the Supreme Court recognizes the rights without really recognizing in the Second Amendment the obligations, and you can't have rights without obligations. And I think what people who have been concerned about this have said to this Supreme Court, you are tending further and further to the right with this, without considering the idea that states can set reasonable obligations on gun ownership. That's what the Supreme Court is starting to do now, has been starting to do, which is to strip away the obligation side and to expand the right side. So yes, you've got the right to own guns. You have the right to own all types of guns. You've got the right to own many guns, but they really haven't enforced the idea that you can have simple things such as gun registration, such as restriction on the number of guns, restriction on the type of guns. And that's where we're headed. And I suspect that as we move further and further into this term, there are cases that are pending out of the Ninth Circuit in the Pacific Northwest that are going to get before the Supreme Court that really expand and solidify the ability of people in all these states to open carry, and will further erode the ability to be able to make sure that there is effective restriction on gun ownership.
Yeah, ReShonda, we've talked about your reporting on this issue, but what further role is the Black press in Texas playing in educating African Americans on this issue and how to protect themselves?
Well, one is just educating our people. Representative Reynolds hit the nail on the head when he said elections have consequences. Conservative activists have been pushing for this kind of law in Texas for years, but those measures got little traction in the previous 3 legislative sessions. Well, in 2019, a permitless carry bill didn't even get a committee hearing. And so we've seen a shift when we don't turn out to vote. They pack the legislature with people that will further their agenda. And as we said earlier, the NRA is pushing a lot of this, and they're getting their agenda passed. So our job with the Black press is to continue to educate, arm our people with the knowledge on how to arm themselves with training. Even though it's not required, we still want to educate our readers on, getting themselves trained and being responsible gun owners if they're going to take that route. But it's all a matter of continuing to educate.
Yeah, and before we get Dr. Chavis's closing thoughts, I want to give everyone else a chance to give us a minute of their closing thoughts. I want to start with Representative Reynolds.
I'll piggyback on my constituent, ReShonda. She hit the nail on the head. We have to continue to educate, inform, and empower the Black community about responsible gun ownership. This is the law until it changes. So I do encourage people to go, and if you're going to get a gun, get training. You don't have to do it, but you should do it so that you can have a gun responsible. Go in the gun range so you know how to operate and own a gun. And then let's get empowered and informed when it comes to elections, and getting engaged and making sure that we elect people that care and put people over politics.
Yeah, and Attorney Tarver, your closing thoughts on this?
I concur with everyone here. The fact of the matter is, what we really have to be careful of is that this is one of the first steps in a concerted effort to arm America, to increase the fear of African Americans by white Americans, and to make sure that we are kept in a certain position. I believe in Black gun ownership. I'm a Black gun owner myself. However, we need to make sure we understand that there are consequences to Black gun ownership, and that there is a larger picture at stake, and make sure that we're not playing into their hands with that.
And Sam Collins of the Washington Informer, your closing thoughts on this?
Gun ownership is a key part of African American sovereignty, and we have to practice responsible gun ownership and understand what that entails. And we also have to separate the issue of gun violence from gun ownership, and understand that there are greater forces at play as to why we are killing one another in our communities.
Well, we're going to leave it to you, Dr. Chavis.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists. It's been a great discussion. And again, go back to something that Attorney said, as well as our representative. We can't face the future. We should not face the future out of fear. I'm talking about fear within Black America. It's something that was said earlier. Listen, we still have low voter turnout in too many of our communities. The browning of America is a statistical fact. Blacks and brown and other communities of color are growing. And that has caused fear among whites. That's why they don't want us to vote. And that's why they're arming themselves, because they think that there's going to be a violent clash between the races. And some people want to see that. Some people want to feed that reality. But I think what we have to do in the Black media, the Black press, we have to continue to educate. We have to continue to advocate for what's right. But also, I think our narrative has to be also around self-love. Black people loving Black people, and Black people loving all of humanity. And we can't expect people who are not from us or about us to do something for us that we're not willing to do for ourselves. The fratricide and the homicides that are going on in our community, we have to do much more to stop that. Yes, there are external influences, no question about it. Poverty, gentrification, homelessness, joblessness, all these things, engage and impinge upon how we treat each other. But at the end of the day, other people are not going to train us to love one another. That's something that we have to do. And one of the aspects of the Black press is to put forth those examples of how we can achieve progress, even amidst all the contradictions that have been discussed today. So I leave this discussion more determined than ever to keep pushing forward. We can't face a lot of fear. We have to face tomorrow with a lot of self-determination, a lot of self-love, a lot of training, a lot of educating, and keep pushing forward. So I believe that our future is going to get better, but we have to participate and contribute to our future being better for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations to come. A luta continua, the struggle continues. It's not on pause, the struggle continues.
Absolutely. Well, listen, tomorrow, we have another high profile conversation, a conversation you don't want to miss. Justin Fairfax, who ran for governor of Virginia, was beset by false allegations, what turned out to be false allegations of sexual misconduct. Reporters now are admitting that they did not vet the accusers. They did not vet the stories. They published stories that they now regret because these things just did not happen. Governor Cuomo of New York resigned or was forced to resign over allegations of sexual misconduct. Well, now we're getting more and more reports in mainstream media that they also reported unfactual things about Governor Cuomo, which led to his demise and his brother Chris at CNN. Well, it's very important that we get into this discussion right here on Let It Be Known, how it is responsible for us as journalists to make sure we have the facts straight before we destroy someone's careers and lives. We're going to have that conversation tomorrow on Let It Be Known, so join us.